Hello and welcome to CollectaThoughts, the show where I talk about video games, and today we're going to be talking about Star Wars The Knights of the Old Republic on the Switch, which is very much the first thing I want to address here, as Knights of the Old Republic, or KOTOR, is very much known for being a classic PC RPG, and I would say I'm primarily a PC gamer. So why did I go for the Switch version in this case? And to start that, I will say that the PC version of this game has given me nothing but problems over the years, especially running the game on modern systems. I get a lot of crashes or just very odd problems with the UI that just make it a bit of a pain. Also, with my YouTube channel, it kind of became a problem as well that I wouldn't be able to record gameplay so I could review it, which is an added thing that most people wouldn't have to worry about, which kind of, destroyed my option of just playing on my old PC that I have, the Windows XP machine that I grew up with. That could probably run this game just fine. But then the Switch version got announced and I decided just to use it because I expect ports of older games on consoles to at least be a lot more stable than running the original software on modern hardware. Regardless though, what this means for this review is that I'm reviewing that version of the game and I'll talk about its advantages and disadvantages as we get into it. But first I want to start by talking about the story, and Knights of the Old Republic of course takes place thousands of years before the original trilogy, which allows it of course to just have a much more creative liberty with the setting, also allows it to have just a lot more Siths and Jedis walking around given the lore of the Star Wars universe. Which I'm not going to get too deep into it because, well, I'll be honest, I'm not particularly an expert. But what I can say about the story of Knights of the Old Republic is that it is a very engaging and, in a lot of ways, personal story taking place in this universe, having some really creative plot threads that you wouldn't expect out of a create your own character type of RPG. Now, I will say that, like a lot of people who have been on the internet for a while, I have been spoiled on this game and I knew it going into it what its big twist would be, but I was also surprised that that twist was not all there was to it. In fact, the twist seems to happen about 2/3 into the game, meaning that you actually have some time to absorb that information and also see how it affects the world. Now, I'm not gonna spoil what this is, even though I'm sure a lot of you watching probably already know because you've probably been spoiled as well. But if you haven't, I do think you're in a lucky spot and you should probably go into it blind. Because I do think that the story is the strongest element of Knights of the Old Republic. Not only does it have an interesting plot thread, but I do think there's a couple things adding to it that do make it stand out in the genre, especially among other Star Wars games. Starting with the side characters, especially the party members. Playing this game, of course, you'll be able to add party members, some of them optional, some of them that you'll meet through the story, but all of them are fairly interesting. Of course, some are more developed than others, of course the ones that are part of the main story, it is to be expected, but even the optional ones do have a fairly interesting backstory, and it's kinda up to you to figure that out. The way it works is you talk to them to kind of get to know them, but at some point you will run out of talking options, and what you can do instead is kind of add them to your party and just play with them. And this will make them more attached to you. It's not a bar or a number you can see, but once in a while the game will pause to tell you that, hey, this character might want to talk to you, signifying that they have new options. Usually this will show up after the option has already been unlocked, so if you really want to and if you're paying attention, you can actually just check by talking to them and maybe, speed up the process. And this is good because of course it adds to the characters, but also unlocks possible side quests, some of which who might actually end up being very important to the end game. Not gonna spoil once again, but of course expect these to be more on the characters that get introduced by the main story rather than the optional ones. And in terms of writing, these guys are likable, they are interesting, they are different from each other. They have a personality that I can talk about. And as an example, I will actually use one of the few optional characters, Juhani, who you have to convince to come back to the light side to join you, making her an interesting character in the fact that she's kind of in the middle of the force spectrum, I guess I would call it, but she wants to be on one of the sides. Unlike, for example, let's say another later companion, which doesn't really want to be on either side and enjoys that middle. And this is interesting because the way you talk to them will or can influence them in which side they will end up in, which leads me to talk about the other thing about this game, which is you can be a Jedi or a Sith or neither, because the game allows you to do various choices throughout the game, which will affect how people perceive you and how the game plays out towards the end, as it measures your actions on a bar, which is light on one side and dark on the other, and of course pushing where you are on that bar depending on your choices. That being said, I do think neutral would make the game harder, because you do get quite a lot of bonuses and perks by going with one of the sides, which is a big incentive, which I guess it's fine. I do think most people playing this game will probably want to be on one side or the other. And it's not like the game is completely different on if you are a Sith or a Jedi, as the game still has to follow a certain structure, so you go through the same levels. As cool as it would be to have a completely different game depending on what path you took, that's not a very realistic thing to ask of a video game. But it still does quite a lot, and like I said, the way people perceive you and the way the game treats you is a big deal. And that's kind of the best part of this game, is the story and the characters. All I'm saying is, my marriage with Bastilla is next week and you're all invited. That was I don't know, I thought this was gonna be a funny joke. That's fine, let's move on to the gameplay, which is where I think things for me kinda take a downturn. I'm not a huge fan of it, I must say. It has a very MMO-like feel to it, in the way that during combat you select a target and then the actions get done automatically as you select them. For example, if you select the attack, it will keep doing attacks as long as it can unless it's stopped. And if you do something like healing, raising a shield, or do a special attack, it will do that action after it has done the one that it's doing, and then it will resume the earlier one, which is probably the attack one. And this is not quite turn-based combat, it's not quite action RPG combat, it's this weird in between that, I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of. Even if it is a very classic RPG mode of play, where, you know, your attacks are basically dice rolls, where a certain number will give you the regular attack, another might miss, and then another might do a critical, and of course, playing that against the enemy's own stats, which, you know, classic RPG stuff that I don't really want to go too deep into. Regardless, it's just not a combat I personally enjoy, but you might, especially if you want to raise your character to something very specific and you know how to do it with the level up system. If you don't, there is an auto level up, but it is kind of weird knowing what it's gonna decide for you. It's not like it asks you if you want to be, you know, dual lightsabers or if you want to do pistols. It's just kind of basing it on what your character is like at that moment. So I wouldn't recommend it, but it is something that is there, and I understand why, because it can be very daunting, especially at the beginning of the game where the stats might not quite make sense. So that's something to be aware of. Adding to the gameplay now, we're gonna talk a bit about the traversal. And it's pretty interesting, as Knights of the Old Republic is basically divided into planets. And what this really means gameplay wise is that each planet is its own area, which you can fast travel to using your ship. And this is kind of a spoiler because, well, for the first, I want to say maybe 5 to 7 hours of the game, you'll be in the first area going through the story before it really opens up. Which sounds kind of weird, spending almost a fourth of the game in a single area, but it is also kind of the biggest area, or at least the most varied area. Since each planet, it's kind of its own setting and it has very much a theme to it, while the first area is divided into a few zones that are quite different from each other. Regardless though, this brings up the problem that I have with the traversal, which is within each one of these areas, with them being quite big, makes it so when traversing back and forwards for missions or especially side missions, a bit of a tedious endeavor. Yeah, sometimes there's a few random encounters or maybe there'll be combat in between an area, which is fine, but still most of the time you are just kind of walking from a place to another and not a whole lot is happening. Maybe a better fast travel system. There is a fast travel system where you can go back to the ship or your base and back to the place where you fast traveled from, making it easy to change between party members. But an actual way of just traversing the world would also be nice, especially since the map is already all labeled with each area that you usually want to travel to. Maybe an auto run would also be nice, but with the Joy-Con drift on the Switch, you kinda just get that one for free. Regardless though, the rest I want to talk about in the traversal is in the graphics. So to finish this gameplay bit off, what I want to say is it feels like an RPG from the early 2000s, and you have to be aware of that when going into it. I'm personally not a huge fan of this style, but you might be. It's not like it's a bad style. My advice would really just be try and learn the skill system and the level up system in a way to make it as least frustrating as possible. Also, before we move on, I do want to say that I did say that a fast travel would be nice because you're always running back and forth, which might make you think this is some sort of fetch quest hell, but it really isn't, especially in the main mission. Some of the side missions can feel like that, but usually even those have an interesting story going along with them that makes you not really care too much. Regardless though, moving on to the graphics, I do think this game looks nice. As a Star Wars game, it really captures that world, but once again, it is a game from the early 2000s and you have to be aware of that. Especially for the kind of scope it's going for, with multiple planets and completely different environments in each one of those planets. And I do think in a lot of ways it has aged greatly. I do think that when you're in a big open area, it still looks really good. Like for example, the desert has a very impressive view. Then inside areas are also really well done. They're full of details, but they also kind of suffer from a lot of them looking very samey. For example, cantinas are super detailed. They have characters doing things in them, which kind of adds, a sense of it being alive. But also, every cantina kind of looks the same. Then, for example, we have areas that aren't quite inside areas and they're not quite open areas that can feel very samey, like corridors. And it's not really a problem until you maybe start getting lost in them and have to check the map every corner, which is a bit annoying, I think. The only thing helping this is that most areas just have a fairly linear path. Think of it like an open world, but it still has a very linear path in the way that where you reach and enter the planet is the beginning of the area, and the furthest away from that position is the ending or where the kind of finale of that area will be at, usually. Regardless of any of that though, I do think it looks nice, there is variety to it, but your mileage may vary. I personally really like this old style of graphics, but you might not. And I do think even if you do like this style of graphics, I do think something that might get to you, samey looking corridors. I know you probably can't tell from this gameplay footage because it's from early on in the game where you're just always moving around from different place to different place, but trust me, you will notice it while playing it and it might get to you. Personally, it took me quite a while to finish this game because I did end up getting a bit bored in certain areas of just walking back and forwards, even if the story at those exact moments was quite interesting and engaging. That being said, of course you can mitigate this by focusing on doing the story, and to be fair, if you keep yourself within level then you'll be fine, because one of the things about this game is it clearly doesn't really want you to be over leveled. It's quite hard to do so, but also by the end of the game you should probably also be at the max level if you did just a few side quests. which is nice, but also, be careful with your skill points because they are very much finite. Regardless of any of that though, now I want to talk about the Switch version, specifically what it's different here. And graphics wise, it seems to be very similar. The main thing, and this is probably the first thing you'll find out if you look up this version of the game, is the text box at the top. This is the text box that shows up when you're in combat, and I'll be honest, I agree with everyone else, it's kinda stupid. It covers way too much of the screen, especially when it doesn't give you particularly any important information. In the original version, this was a mostly see-through square with text on it, and it wasn't that distracting. Here, it's like a big text bubble, and also they made the background darker so you can barely see through it, and it covers way too much of the screen, especially when playing handheld. Hopefully this gets patched. Hopefully it's already patched by the time you watch this. The other thing to mention, of course, is the controls. They did make quite a lot of changes to the UI and the way it works, and basically here you can select targets using the shoulder buttons, and then using the D-pad you can select the abilities you want to use. And it works fine enough. I would still prefer using a mouse, but of course on the Switch that's not really a realistic option. So this is a nice compromise, I would say. There's also two other moments where the controls are completely different from the regular gameplay that I think I should talk about, but it is hard to talk about without spoiling too much. But all I'll say, one is a turret section, and that one feels kinda slow. I don't really know how that one plays on PC because I never got that far, but it doesn't feel great here. And the other one is a race one. It's a very simplistic race, so it works just fine, I think, and I had no problem beating those side quests that involve that gameplay. The other thing to mention, of course, about this port is how it plays on the TV and on handheld. And I'll say that, honestly, I preferred playing the TV mode here, just because I enjoyed playing it on a big TV, and the Switch seems to handle it pretty well at what seems like a 1080p 30 FPS, which I think for this game was the right decision. You don't really need a high frame rate to play this game, and I appreciate being able to play it on a higher resolution, at least for Switch standards. Now in handheld mode the game also looks nice, and of course you get portability, which for this game I think it's great, and also because of it being kind of an older game, it also seems that the battery life playing it is fairly good. Like I said in other videos with my Switch reviews, I have an original Switch which does not have the best battery life, and I still managed to squeeze out about 4 hours of gameplay before needing to charge. Which means if you have a newer Switch, you might actually be able to play this for way longer. Supposedly, I can't test it. So yeah, as a Switch port, it's actually really good if it wasn't for that text box thing. It may not sound like a lot, but you have to understand that it shows up during every combat encounter. But it should be an easy fix if the developers are willing to patch it. Regardless, it's a good port, surprisingly enough, and from what I read online, it seems to be a better port than some of the other KOTOR ports that we have seen in the past. So if you're like me and you're having troubles playing the PC version, then this might be the one you want to give a try. Final thing I want to just quick mention is the music of this game, which is Star Wars. It sounds like Star Wars and it's really good, but something that it does really well as well is the environment noise. If you're standing in a cave or in one of the cantinas, it sounds like you're in that place, and it's really well done, especially for the time. And adding to that is also during combat, things like weapons, sabers, lightsabers, and all the ranged weapons sound legitimately great, with those iconic Star Wars sounds being implemented in a way that feels natural and realistic, in a way that a sci-fi sound can be realistic, But yeah, it sounded really good during combat, and that's kind of the only thing I wanted to say about the sound. That's why I put it here at the end. Regardless though, this was a really good game. It's now very obvious to me why it's regarded as a classic, but I will say still that I'm not a huge fan of the gameplay, and you might not be either, so be aware of that. it might not be for you. But also, like me, you might want to put up with it to experience these stories in this game. So, you have to weigh those kinds of things yourself because we're all different, I guess. And for those reasons, I am giving Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic a 7 out of 10. You probably already know why I give it this score. If you don't, the gist of it is, it's a really good RPG, but the gameplay just doesn't really vibe with me, and that's why it's at a 7. That's as simple as I can get it. And that would be my recommendation. Are you willing to put up with a gameplay that you might not like to experience a story? Well then, if so, yeah, try this game out. And I do think that, once again, if you were having troubles with the PC version, that this is a good version to try out. If you already enjoy this type of RPG, then I think you're gonna have a great time with it in general. So yeah, play it. If you're either a hardcore fan of Star Wars or a casual fan, I think both these types of people will enjoy this. So in that way, it's also an easy recommendation, as while it has a lot of lore for those people, it's also an easy to get into and understand story. And so those are my recommendations. Hopefully you can tell if this game is for you or not based on those. But regardless of that, I hope that you enjoyed watching. And if so, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.